down the manifestation bringing down the manifestation of God's glory into this structure, right? So it wasn't there to make a place for God to dwell, and it wasn't there to cause the manifestation of God's glory in the structure, as kinyan maseh hakarbanot, as was the function, right, of the doing of the karbanot. And again, I'll explain all this more in a minute. As it says, and now he actually quotes two different psukim, as it says, and he's quoting here, if you look back in your Tanakh, toward the end of chapter 29, verse 43, when we're talking about the Tamid, as it says, right? And I will meet there, right? When you bring the Tamid sacrifice, I will meet there with Bnei Israel. And also, Moshe Rabbeinu attested to this when he said, Ze hadavar asher tziva Hashem ta'asu v'yeira alechem kavod Hashem. I'll get back to that verse in a minute. This is actually a verse from Vayikra, where Moshe says, this is the thing that you shall do, talking about particular sacrifices that we'll talk about in a minute, such that the glory of God will appear to you. So he's saying there's two functions that other things have, which the Mizbach HaKtorah does not have. Right? One is the function of the kelim, that's to make a place for God to dwell. The other is the function of the sacrifices, which are to pull down the manifestation of God's glory. But that's not what the Mizbach HaKtorah is for. Rather, he says, rather, haya inyan zeh hamizbeach lechabed et ha'el yitbarach acharei bo'o lekabel b'ratzon avodat amo b'karbanot haboker v'ha'erev. Right? Rather, the function or the essence, right, of this altar was to honor the blessed God after, I'm sorry for my gendered language, right, after he comes, or after he came to accept with favor the service of his people with the sacrifices of morning and evening, and to greet his presence with a gift of Ketoret. Okay, what I'm going to do is actually, so that I can close this share, I'm just going to put this, if I can figure out how to do this, I'm going to put this text in the chat for those who would like to be able to keep referring back to it as you would like.
So I think it's odd that Sforno does not cite any text.
Yes.
Or evidence of what he thinks is its purpose.
Exactly. I will talk about that in a second, as soon as I figure out how to send this. It says I have to click Control Enter to send. Okay. For that, do you have this in the chat? No, right? Help. Anybody there who can help me? It says Control Enter to send. Control Enter. I have no idea how to do this. Anybody know anything about?
What are you trying to?
Well, yeah, why don't you go into the chat and chat and then put something there? Or have you already done that?
No, I did. I just put it in I put Sforno in the chat, but I don't seem to be able to send it for some reason. I don't know why. Okay.
Does it say to everyone in your chat?
It says to everyone. And when I try to hit the arrow, it says
Control
Enter
Enter
to send. And when I do Control Enter, it does nothing. So you will not have this in the chat. I apologize. If anybody wants me to share screen again, just let me know. I'll do that, okay? Because I can't figure out how to do this. Sorry about that. Exactly. So who said that you find it odd that that he doesn't share any evidence of that?
I did.
Who said that? You said that. Great. Exactly. So I'm gonna actually wait. Did somebody? I'm trying to. So how?
I just tried the chat
to send it on. I'm not.
I just tried it to see if it worked. So
yeah, you just. I don't know why I can't do it. It's very strange. Richard, I'm going to try to send this just to you and see if I can do that, and maybe then you can share it to everyone. Send it to everyone. You say I don't seem to do that. Okay, I apologize. I will just share my screen again while we go through this text. Okay, so there's the text again. So before we get to what makes him think that that's what the Ketoret does, I just want to focus a little bit on the other two functions that he talks about for things other than the Ketoret. Okay, so the first one he says is that the other kelim, right, are to enable God to dwell in their midst. and I'm going to kind of share and unshare while we do this. So, so I want to mention in terms of that, the Sforno says elsewhere, actually, even Ezra suggests the same idea. And actually, the more modern scholar, the 20th century scholar Kasuto, actually offers a similar idea, which is that when they look at the core furnishings of the Mishkan, the Aron and its covering, the Ketoret, the menorah and the shulchan, but not the Mizbach HaKetoret, right? So again, the Aron and the Ketoret and the Kodesh Kodeshim, the shulchan and the menorah, the table and the lamp. The idea that's put forth by several of these commentators, medieval and modern, is that those are the core furnishings that you would put in an Airbnb. Right? You want to set up a room in your home for people to stay in. The example actually that Sforno offers is the Isha Shunamit, right, who makes a room for Elisha, who travels around and comes to their home. And what does she put? She puts a bed, a table, and a lamp, right? And a chair, right? So the Aron and Ketoret are essentially kind of God's throne, or perhaps God's throne and footstool, right? The menorah is the lamp, and the shulchan is the table, right? And the notion being that if we want to sort of imagine, right, how we can make a home for God, even though we're not imagining that God is actually there physically, but nevertheless, we need to kind of imagine what it would mean to be a home. We actually do that by furnishing it like a home. Right? So you have that explanation that works for the Aron and the Ketoret. That's kind of the seat or the bed, right? Where God's kind of sort of would seat God's self, right? You have the lamp, you have the shulchan, but that Mizbach HaKetoret, that's not what that does, right? It doesn't have any kind of analogy in a human home, right? So that is the idea that Sforno's working with, right? That those kelim are essentially furnishings, right? Just like the furnishing in a room that you would set up, a guest room or an Airbnb. So that's what he says. The Mizbach Ketoret does not do that. Now, when he goes back to the Mizbach, to the sacrifices, he says that also the sacrifices have a different function. And he says the function of the sacrifices is to lehorid, right here, lehorid mar'ek fodo babayit, right? To bring down the manifestation of God's glory into the structure. That's what the karbanot, that's what the sacrifices do. And for that, he actually brings two sources, right? One, as I pointed out, is 2943, talking about the sacrifice of the Tamid, God says, and that's where I'll meet. But he actually brings a much better source, right? Which is this. He says, and so Moshe Rabbeinu attested when he said, Zeh hadavar asher tzivah Hashem ta'asu, v'yira alechem kvod Hashem. So I want to look at that source with you for a second. This is in Vayikra. Okay, so this is Vayikra 9:6. So if everybody can turn to that. So first, let's just think what Vayikra chapter 9 is about. And I'm sure that most of you are like me and had no idea what Vayikra 9 is about and where it kind of fits in the trajectory. So I will tell you where it fits in. Chapter 8 in Vayikra is actually the chapter about the Miluim, meaning the consecration and investiture of the Kohanim. The Kohanim in chapter 8 are dressed in their garments, and then they are actually consecrated, right? Oil is put on them, etc. That's chapter 8, and that goes on for 7 days. And then in chapter 9, there's the 8th day. There's the 8th day. And on the 8th day, Moshe calls Aharon and his sons and Ziknei Yisrael and the elders, and he commands them to do a whole sacrificial ritual. And in that context, he says in chapter 9, verse 6, this is the thing which God has commanded you to do, such that v'yera alechem kvod Hashem, such that God's glory will manifest to you. And then they do this whole sacrificial thing. And at the end of chapter 9, verse 23, it says at the end of verse 23, Vayera Kvod Hashem el kol ha'am, that God's glory in fact manifested to all the people, just as Moshe had said, right? Do the sacrificial service so that God's glory will manifest. Now God's glory in fact manifests. And verse 24, a fire comes out from the presence of God, and all of the people see this and they shout and fall on their faces. Okay, so it's this passage which the Sforno is quoting. I'm going to pull this Sforno back up. Okay, and so he says, the furnishings sort of make an abode for God. The sacrifices then pull down the manifestation of God's presence into that abode, right? Those are those two functions, but the Mizbach HaKetoret doesn't have that function at all. The Mizbach HaKetoret's function is to honor God after God comes to accept the sacrifices that were offered to pull down God's presence. Okay, and then he actually does offer a pasuk, but the pasuk actually doesn't really mention Ketoret. Right? He brings a pasuk from Divrei Hayamim, Havu Lashem Kivod Shemo Su'u Mincha Uvo Lefanav. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name, raise an offering, and come before him. That doesn't specifically mention the Ketoret. It just introduces the idea that sort of when God is there, we offer some sort of an gift to God, right, to sort of greet God's presence. Okay, everybody with me? Yes? Cool. Okay, so before I take Sforno further, I want to sort of recap what he's saying. He is suggesting that the reason, and this kind of aligns a little bit, Richard, with what you were saying before, that maybe the reason Mizbach HaKetoret comes later is because it has it's different in some way. And for him, the difference is it has a totally different function. And that function is not about bringing God into the Mishkan, right? It's about rather responding to God's presence once God's presence manifests in the Mishkan.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead.
So since he cites the pasuk from Vayikra in the Parshat HaMiluim, where there are all kinds of korbanot given and no Ketoret, but immediately following that, we have the
Yes.
Ketoret of Nadav and Avihu.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So,
yes.
which suggests maybe what they thought the function of the Ketoret was, and they were wrong.
Well, actually, okay, so perfect. That's exactly where I want to go.
Wait, Dr. Steinmetz?
Yeah, Danny, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just to build off of that,
Yeah.
I think that one way to understand that is that Nadav and Avihu might have actually sacrificed themselves to prevent the kavod from going through the entire Israelite camp.
Okay, cool. So I don't want to actually deal with sort of
Okay.
everything
Sorry.
about the Nadav and Avihu episode and what they did. Well, we could go there, but that would be a whole other thing. But I
All
do
right,
want
for the
to
next
pick up
Yemei Iyun.
on the idea that if you have chapter 9 open, then you can't fail to notice that actually the very next thing that happens, right, after God manifests through this fire that comes out, right, and consumes the sacrifice, is that in fact there are individuals who greet God's presence with Ketoret. Right? If I were Sforno, right, I might have quoted that pasuk, but of course, Sforno is not going to quote that pasuk because it's an illicit sacrifice of Ketoret. So why would you quote that pasuk? But what I think is fascinating is that, in fact, Nadav Avihu's act, illicit though it was, and again, I don't want to talk about what might have been wrong with it, but it's essentially intuitively picking up, right, on the fact that when God's presence appears, you need to respond in some way. And they respond with Ketoret, which is exactly the function of Ketoret that Sforno is highlighting, right? So
Can I ask a question? Just that it might be helpful or harmful to this thesis, but I don't remember when you do the Ketoret compared to doing the Tamid. When do you do this? So if you did it afterwards, for instance, that would be helpful to saying, oh, now that God's here, we're doing the cover.
Exactly. So I had to ask myself the same question. It's not clear from the biblical text, right? It just says morning and evening. But according to Chazal, it's actually done right after the Tamid, morning and evening. So it's exactly, so I checked, I think they're picking up on exactly that idea. So what I want to suggest before I go on to my own idea, which is, I think, also interesting, is that Sforno essentially is offering an idea which is sort of picks up on this particular function of Ketoret as being utterly different from the function of everything else in the Mishkan. That idea is actually borne out by Nadav Avihu's second, somebody else is waiting here, by Nadav and Avihu's act, which is a response to the appearance of God's presence. And also, something interesting is that if you just look kind of at the geography, of the text. In other words, if you would just kind of overlay Shmot and Vayikra onto each other, you have the same sequence, right? In other words, if you think of here, let me actually pull back a couple of sentences, okay? Another thing Sforno is suggesting, I think, right, is that Truma and Tetzaveh, I mean, chapters 25 to chapter 29, are not trying to give you, it's not a kind of IKEA how-to manual, right? How you put the Mishkan together, right? It's not a blueprint for the Mishkan. The Ramban already says this, right? The Ramban points out that the order, and Talmud said this before the Ramban, that the order of instructions in Truma and Tetzaveh is actually different from the order of the instructions when Moshe transmits the instructions to the people, as well as different from the actual order of the construction of the Mishkan later on in Vayakal Pekudei, right? So there's something about the order of the instructions which is not necessarily a kind of an image of the Mishkan as it stands, nor is it a kind of manual as to how to put this thing together. It's doing something different. Parshat Truma and Tetzaveh are doing something different than just giving you a description for the Mishkan. In some way, Parshat Truma and Tetzaveh are kind of saying something about the core functions of the Mishkan, right? And I think Sforno is picking up on that, right? We're not trying to give you a layout. If we were going to give you a layout, we would put the Mizbach HaKetoret with the other furnishings. And actually every other time in Vayakal and Pekudei, it describes the Mishkan and has the Mishkan put together, the Mizbach HaKetoret appears exactly with the other furnishings, exactly where you would want it. What Sforno's picking up on is that when God is telling Moshe about the Mishkan, God is doing something other than giving a kind of step-by-step in order manual of how to put the Mishkan together. God is saying something about the function. And I think beyond that, what I want to suggest is that you can actually perhaps imagine that what's happening in Truma Tetzaveh, meaning chapters 25 to chapter 29, is that essentially God is describing what you need to do to inaugurate the Mishkan, meaning it's not focused on the Mishkan as it stands over time, but it's focusing on the inauguration of the Mishkan. Because if you think, again, at Vayikra chapters 8 to 9, Vayikra chapters 8 to 9, if you kind of have two hands here, put one hand in Vayikra chapters 8 to 9 and turn back to Shmot with the other hand. Vayikra chapter 8 is fulfilling what it says in Shmot chapters 28 and chapters 29. And chapter 28 is the Big Day Kahuna, the priestly garments. Chapter 29 is the consecration of the Kohanim. And both those things are actually enacted in Vayikra chapter 8. Vayikra chapter 9 then has an additional day, the 8th day not mentioned in Shmot. We're not going to talk about why for now. But chapters 8 and 9 together are essentially the consecration and inauguration of the Kohanim and of the Mishkan. And if we imagine Truma and Tetzaveh as focusing on the inauguration of the Mishkan and the service in the Mishkan, then we can understand why you wouldn't have, according to Sforno, why you wouldn't have Ketoret mentioned in there at all. But Ketoret plays no role whatsoever in the Miluim, right? If you read through chapters 8 and 9 of Vayikra, there is no Ketoret, right? It doesn't play any role there. So if you're thinking of Shmot as describing the Miluim, the inauguration of the Mishkan, it makes sense that there's no Ketoret there. And furthermore, there can't be Ketoret there, according to Sforno, because the purpose of the Ketoret is to greet God's presence, and God's presence isn't there yet. Right? God's presence only comes at the very end of the whole ritual of inaugurating the Mishkan and consecrating the Kohanim, right? Which is why it doesn't appear at all, right? According to this approach, that's why it doesn't appear at all in Truma and Tetzaveh, right? Because Truma and Tetzaveh, if again, from this perspective, if you imagine it as talking about how the Mishkan is set up, right? There is no God in the Mishkan while it's being set up. Right? The presence of God only comes at the end of that whole process. And therefore, according to Sforno's approach, that the Ketoret is about greeting God's presence, there's no room for Ketoret in that at all. Ketoret only shows up, right, in chapter 10 of Vayikra with Nadav Avihu, which is exactly the same spot as it shows up in Sefer Shmot. Yes, everybody with me? Sort of, cool. Question, clarification, we're good? More or less? Speak, okay, right, cool. So what I want to do
Well, wait,
now,
but I would say just one thing. I mean, but still you could describe, even though God's not there, you have to have you have the kalim, you have everything that you have prepared for when it is. So you would still, still would want to have it to describe here.
Cool. So what I'm suggesting, again, Sforno doesn't spell all this out, but what I'm suggesting for Sforno is that we're misreading Truman Tetzaveh, right? Truman Tetzaveh is not a kind of like Vayakal B'Kude is, a manual or a blueprint. That's not what it is. It's a functional thing, and therefore there simply is no possible function to imagine for this thing yet. It doesn't exist, right? It's simply, from a functional perspective, it doesn't exist. That's what I'm saying. Sforno doesn't say that explicitly. I'm saying that on Sforno's, you may find that not terribly satisfying, but right. And again, what I think is fascinating about this is, among other things, is that it simply maps directly onto Vayikra, where there is no Ketoret, right, at all in 8 and 9, and then all of a sudden, the second, right, we have the sacrifices and God's presence appears. We also have this gift of Ketoret. Okay, I want to offer a completely different interpretation, my own interpretation, which I think also kind of draws on this mapping of Shemot and Vayikra. Okay, and for this, let's go back to chapter 30 of Shemot, because we didn't actually read the whole passage. So, beginning of chapter 30, instructions for exactly how to fashion the Mizbach Ketoret. Psukim, Pasuk Vav tells you exactly where to put it. Zayin and Chet tell you exactly what to do with it. You bring the Ketoret in the evening, you bring the Ketoret in the morning. Chapter 29, don't bring a Ketoret Zara and don't bring any sacrifices on it. But then there's one more Pasuk, right, which is Pasuk Yud, which says, V'chiper Aharon al karnotav achat bashana midam chatat ha-kippurim achat bashana yechaper alav l'dorotechem kodesh kodashim hu l'Hashem. Right? One time a year, Aaron shall effect, you would probably translate atonement, but with Jacob Milgram, a scholar of Leviticus, I'm going to translate purgation, right? Aaron should effect purgation on the karnot, on the horns of this altar one time a year by means of the blood of the purgation chatat offering. Once a year for all your generations, Aharon should do this purgation ritual. It is Holy of Holies to God. So what we have here is a second function mentioned for the Mizbach Ketoret, right? The first function is the Ketoret function, which Sforno had a particular interpretation of the Ketoret function. And here there's another function, which is that once a year, right, Aharon does this purgation ritual. What are we talking about when in this purgation ritual? What are we referring to? What day of year are we talking about?
I think they mix the blood together and they put it on the don't they mix the blood together and put on Yom Kippur?
On Yom Kippur, exactly. So this is talking about Yom Kippur. It doesn't make that clear here. It doesn't say what day, but it's the once a day where Aaron effects purgation. So let's take a look at that. We can keep one hand in Shemot if you want, and let's look at the Yom Kippur ritual, which is described in Vayikra 16. So there's obviously many different parts of this ritual, but if we look at Psukim Yud Chet and Tet, we have the particular thing which is done on this Mizbeach. V'yatzal Mizbeach asher lifnei Hashem. Aaron should go out, or the Kohen Gadol should go out to the altar which is before God and effect purgation on it, v'chiper alav, and he takes the blood of the par, of the bull and the goat, and he puts it on the horns of the Mizbeach Saviv, and he then sprinkles on it 7 times, v'tiharo v'kidsho mitumot b'nei Yisrael, and he should purify it and consecrate it, right, from the impurities of B'nai Israel. So he's both making atonement on it, and in that process, he is purifying it, and he is also consecrating it, which is interesting, right? L'kadesh it, right, is what is initially done in chapters 8 and 9 of Vayikra, right, when the altar and the Mishkan are originally consecrated. Here, he is essentially reconsecrating the altar. Now, why do we have to do this? So let's look back a couple of psukim in Vayikra. Let's look at Pasuk 16. there we're talking about an earlier stage of the atonement or purgation ritual. And why do we do purgation? It says at the end of Pasuk 16, V'chein yaseh, right? He does this purgation on the Kodesh, then he does it on Ohel Moed, hashochein itam b'toch tum'otam. Right? The reason you have to do this purgation ritual is because it dwells, here's this word shochein again, because the Ohel Moed, the Mishkan, dwells, right, with the people in the midst of their impurity. So what does that mean? Right? What that means is that essentially it's pointing to a paradox of the Mishkan, right? That the job of the Mishkan is to create a dwelling place for God in our midst, right? Therefore, the Mishkan has to be perfect, the Mishkan has to be pure, the Mishkan has to be holy. But it's in our midst, right? And we are not perfect, and we are not always pure, and we are not always holy. So what are you going to do about that, right? How can God dwell in our midst? And what you do is you have this ritual once a year that essentially, the way I want to describe it is a kind of a reset button, right? This purification ritual involving the Mizbach HaKetoret is a kind of restore to factory settings. You know that thing when you mess up your computer, you can restore it to factory settings. You'll lose all your data, but right? It's exactly that, right? We've messed this thing up. God can't possibly be in our midst under the circumstances, but we have this button we can press, right? We have this thing that sort of resets it to its original purity and consecrated status. And so I want to suggest that it's the second function. I'm not saying instead of what Sforno says, maybe to get it, maybe complementing what Sforno says, that it's the second function, which really, I think, offers a very good explanation of why the Mizbach HaKetoret does not appear at all, right, in the description of constructing the Mishkan in Truma and Tetzaveh. And again, if we think of Truma and Tetzaveh as describing the Mishkan as it is initially set up and inaugurated and consecrated and purified, then there's no reset button, right? You don't need a reset button. It's this perfect thing. And it's framed perfectly, right? It's introduced at the beginning of chapter 25 with, put this thing together so I can dwell in your midst. At the end of chapter 29, after the description of the entire thing, now I can dwell in your midst. It's this perfect structure inside a perfect literary structure, right? It's a self-contained, perfect, holy, consecrated, pure universe. And at the same time, right, we know, meaning the Torah knows, that it can't stay that way, right? That it will inevitably be defiled by the fact that it's in our midst. And I think that this, and so the sort of at the end we say, and in the future, not now, right? Not during the Miluim, not when we're setting it up, but in the future, you're going to need like an extra instrument, right? An extra tool, right? Next to that reset button. You're going to need something that's going to let you kind of reset it to this initial consecrated, pure, holy status that it started out with. And I want to suggest that actually picks up on actually two things. First of all, I want to map it onto Sefer Vayikra, and then I want to go back to Sefer Shemot for a second. So if you think about Sefer Vayikra, I just pointed out that the Yom Kippur service, which is referred to in Shemot 30, right, this other function of Mizbach HaKetoret, shows up in chapter 16 of Vayikra, right? But what I want to point out is that chapter 16 of Vayikra actually comes right after chapter 9 of Vayikra. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? So let's put one hand in chapter 16 of Vayikra and the other in chapter 9 of Vayikra. So chapter 9 of Vayikra ends again with God's glory appearing to the people. And right after that, as we saw, is Nadav Avihu's offering of incense. And right after that episode of Nadav Avihu in chapter 10, if you go to chapter 10, verse 10, God tells Aharon that his job, the job of the Kohanim, is lahavdil ben kodesh uben chol uben hatamei uben hatahor, right? To distinguish between that which is holy and that which is mundane, between that which is impure and that which is pure. Okay, and then we continue with the Nadav Avihu story a little bit, and now we have 5 chapters which seem totally having nothing to do with the story. Chapter 11, what's chapter 11 about?
Kashrut.
Right, what we call kashrut, which animals you can eat and which you can't eat. And why can't you eat those other animals? Because they are
Tamei and
Tamei.
tamei, right?
Sounds
Not
nice.
treif, they are tamei. In fact, at the very end of chapter 11, it says again, "L'havdil bein hatamei uvein hatahor," right? To separate between the impure and the pure. So chapter 11 is an example, right, of the kind of impurity that Aharon and his sons have to, right, separate out from. Chapter 12 is about the tum'ah that comes from giving birth. Chapter 13, chapter 14, what are they about? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
No, I was just going to guess, so I'm not going to guess. Sarat or something.
Sarat.
They're about Sarat. That's right. And what's the
Yes.
problem with Sarat? It makes you impure. Okay. And then chapter 15 is about various kinds of tum'ah that have to do with different excretions or secretions or whatever, emissions from the body. Okay. And chapter 15 ends with, in verse 31, V'hizartem et bnei Yisrael mitumatam, you should separate bnei Yisrael from impurity, such that they not die, v'lo yamutu b'tumatam b'tam'am et mishkani asher b'tocham, such that they not die through their impurity by defiling my Mishkan, which is in their midst. In other words, chapters 11 through 15 are examples of the kinds of tum'ah that Aaron has to make sure that Bnei Yisrael keep away from, or if they in fact encounter, that they know how to purify themselves from. Okay. So chapter 10 starts with this idea that you have to keep away from the tumah. Chapter 15 ends with the idea that you have to keep away from the tumah, because if not, you will define the sanctuary. And then chapter 16 comes and says, now what happens when the sanctuary is defiled? Because after all, the sanctuary does, right, dwell in the midst of the impure people. Right? So what I'm suggesting is chapter 16 actually comes right after chapters 8 and 9, except that there's this little parenthetical which elaborates the kinds of tum'ah that chapter 16 is, right, that necessitate the ritual of chapter 16 to re-purify and reconsecrate the Mishkan after it inevitably gets defiled by being in the midst of this impure people. And if you look at the beginning of chapter 16, the text actually says exactly what I said. Right, that God says the following thing in chapter 16 to Moshe after the death of Nadav and Avihu. In other words, chapter 16 really does come right after chapters 8 and 9, right? Just like the Nadav and Avihu story come right after chapters 8 and 9. In other words, once again, if you map Vayikra and Shemot onto each other, you see that this second function of Mizbach HaKetoret, right, this function of achieving purgation, achieving re-purifying the Mishkan, also actually comes right after a description of the Miluim service. Is that clear?
Can I ask a little question which may strengthen what you're saying or maybe against it, which is first that there are other things that happen during the Yom Kippur service, which are in the Kadoshim,
Yep.
or the Parochet and the Aron and so on.
Yep.
So I don't know, were they also described initially, and are they a part of the thing? And if they are, that would suggest that's something contrary. On the other hand, just to say the opposite, it also is, you could say that once you get that far in, you're more protected against Tumah. And so you don't have to worry so much about Tumah way there, all the way in there. It's only when you're on the outside of the Kadoshim that you have to worry about that sort of Tumah, and you don't have to worry about it so much inside, and you don't have to protect it so much, because that's the real center of where everything is.
Yeah, so I'm not sure about the second point, and Milgram has a whole thing about that, which you're welcome to read. He has like a 3,000-page book about Vayikra. It's 3 volumes, but But in terms of the first point, yes, there are other things, other places the blood is placed in chapter 16 of Vayikra, which is interesting. But there's something about the Mizbach HaKetoret which is special in this regard. First of all, for whatever reason, right, Shmot pulls just the Mizbach HaKetoret out as the thing on which purgation is done, right? So it sees that as kind of specially for that purpose, right? But the other thing is then chapter 4 of Vayikra, which we won't look at together. Chapter 4 is the chapter that talks about the different chatat sacrifices. And so there's 4 different ones, right? One for the Kohen Gadol, if the Kohen Gadol sins, one for Kol Adat Yisrael, if all the people sin, and then 2 others, right? Those first 2, what's called the Par Kohen Mashiach, right? The Chatat sacrifice of the Kohen Gadol, and what's called rabbinically Par Harlim Davar Shel Tzibur, the Chatat sacrifice when the whole community sins. And by the way, when the Kohen Gadol sins, it says La'ashmat ha'am, so that's also seen as a sin that involves the whole people. Right? Those 2 Chatat sacrifices also uniquely, right, have their blood placed on the Mizbach HaKetoret. So Mizbach HaKetoret does seem to be, kind of specially designed, right, to enable purgation when kind of the whole people has, right, either sinned or become tamei, such that the Mishkan needs to be sanctified. So you're right that there are other elements of the Mishkan that also are involved in the Yom Kippur ritual, but there's something special about the Mizbach HaKetoret in this regard, which comes up both in chapter 4 of Vayikra and also in chapter 30 of Shmot. And we need to look a lot more at the Yom Kippur ritual to figure out why these other things are involved and etc. Right? But these other things all have other functions, is the point, right? The Aron has another function, right? The Aron is the main place where God will appear on top of the Ketoret, right?
So does this. So does
well,
this.
the other function is
Ketoret during
exactly
every day.
Right. That's why I'm saying that I think that my point and Sforno's point actually complement each other, right? That both of them are kind of not afterthoughts in the sense of secondary, right, of secondary importance, but afterthoughts in the sense of that they're things that we need after, right? Right. For Sforno, things that we need after what the Mishkan is all about, which is getting God to show up, right? And for me, something that we need after we have this perfect Mishkan, but it gets defiled by our imperfections, right? And again, both of these functions show up in Vayikra exactly after the Miluim is completed, right? One in chapter 10, Nadav Avihu, and the other in what comes really right at that same spot, right? If you think of chapters 11 through 15, all of these different kinds of tuma as a parenthetical, which is the purgation on the altar. So I just, 2 more seconds, I just wanted to bring us back to 2 more minutes here, rather. 5 really, but I'll speak for 2 and then open it up. To Sefer Shmot is that really fundamental to Sefer Shmot is the question of whether it's possible for God to dwell in our midst, right? Actually, Bnei Yisrael asked this question shortly after they cross the sea. Hayesh Hashem b'krubenu im ayin, is God in our midst, right? And the whole question of whether God can dwell in the midst of people is really central to the second half of Sefer Shmot. And as the Ramban and other Mefarshim point out, it almost doesn't happen, right? According to the Ramban and some other Mefarshim, not Rashi, but according to the Ramban, you read Sefer Shmot straight. In other words, the order of the text maps onto reflects the actual chronological order, which means that while Moses is up on Har Sinai, God commands Moshe to build this Mishkan so that God can dwell in the midst of the people. And then all of a sudden, chapters 32 and 33 come along, which means that there's Chet HaEgel, right? And at Chet HaEgel, God says to Moshe, actually, I can't go with you. I'll send my angel, he'll come to the land, but I can't go with you. And the Ramban, Ibn Ezra say explicitly that means that God is canceling plans for the Mishkan. Like God won't go. The Mishkan means God can go in their midst, and God realizes that that's impossible, right? These people will sin. They have sinned. They will continue to sin. I forgive the people. I'm not going to destroy the people. They should live and be well. They can go to the promised land, but I can't be with them. And God cancels plans for the Mishkan. And then in the course of Moshe's ongoing negotiation with God, where Moshe finally gets God to agree to come with them, right? Moshe says, I'm not going. I'm not going to go if you're not coming with us. And God finally says, okay, I will go with you. And the Ramban points out on the spot, what that means is you can go ahead and build the Mishkan. right? Which is why after the whole Mishkan story, we have Vayakal Pekudah, where Moshe finally calls the people and gives them instructions for the Mishkan, and they put up the Mishkan. So the Mishkan almost doesn't happen according to the narrative of the Sefer Shemot, and really, in a certain sense, can't happen. Right? It's impossible for God to dwell with the people. Right? God is holy and perfect, and we are not. Right? So I think this particular function of Mizbach HaKetoret that I'm highlighting, which shows up in Shemot chapter 30, is a way of acknowledging that from the start, right? Even before we have Chet HaEgel, when God is giving instructions for the Mishkan, God is, in a sense, according to the interpretation I'm offering, saying, this is the perfect vision, and I know it's not going to be perfect. So I'm going to give you kind of a tool, right, to enable you to kind of reset, right? Reset things, right? To their perfect thing over and over again, right? Each year you're going to be able to use this reset button to start again, because I want to be able to be in your midst, and I can't really do that unless we have some way to sort of fix things when you sin or when you become impure. So that's what I want to suggest. I think if you sort of take my thought and Sforno's thought together, they're very interesting in that both of them are suggesting that the function of the Ketoret is something that is kind of, again, not secondary in the sense of less important, but secondary in the sense of something you need after, right, the original setting up of the Mishkan. And both of them, I think, quite interestingly, kind of are show up, right, in Sefer Vayikra just after the inauguration of the Mishkan happens. The question I want to leave you all with, and I don't want to discuss, but I'd be thrilled if anybody sent me an email. I'll give you my email. It's DE for Stula, so Devora Steinmetz at Gmail. So if you have any thoughts, feel free to email me. But the question I want to leave you with is, what is the relationship between these different functions of Mizbach HaKetoret, right? That is a question that emerges from everything I've just said, but it's actually a question that simply emerges from reading this Mizbach HaKetoret passage in Shemot 30, which right there gives these two different functions, right? One is the function of the Ketoret, and the other is that this is the thing. And you're right, Micah, there are other things, but this is the thing, right, that Shemot points to. Right? This is the kli, or this is the thing, right, that enables you to achieve this purgation. And what is the relationship between those two things, the Ketoret on the one hand, and the instrument of purgation on the other hand? So I will leave you with that question, and it looks like we're actually at time. So thank you so much. I hope this was somewhat clear, and we did a lot of traveling through text. And thank you. Have a good, I would say, afternoon. It's night for me here, so have a good rest of your afternoon.